on human rights and democracy in the world and the European Union's policy on the matter. The rapporteur has the floor to begin with for 4 minutes. Mr. Weidenholzer.
Today is a very important day for human rights. We awarded the Sakharov Prize to 2 outstanding women, and now we are talking about the report for 2015 that we will be voting on tomorrow. And 2015 was a decisive year. It was the year of the refugee crisis. It was a year in which solidarity in Europe was demanded, and it was a year where we saw the diminishing role of Europe. And this year, the situation with regard to human rights hasn't really improved. But I don't want to leave it with those pessimistic thoughts, because I think in times of crisis we need to see the essentials, and the essence of Europe is democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. And these are all anchored in the Charter, and these really are the distinctive characteristics of Europe, and it is important that this is reflected in our external policies. The report deals with the not so much with the global situation, but focuses on the various instruments that are at its disposal. Like previous rapporteurs, PREDA, I've taken a systematic approach. I'm not listing all areas where there's conflict. There's an annex for that, and we also have resolutions on matters of urgency. What I've tried to do is, and so for that reason, I have rejected amendments that try to change that presentation. It is important that we recognize the challenges that face us, and this is why we have various institutions, including the special envoy. Mr. Stavridis is an excellent ally and provided some excellent work. And we are constantly told how important the representatives of the Union are. And in order to strengthen our policy, I think it is important for us to pay further attention to the increasing restrictions on civil society. This is really a threat, and one which we see extending. Without representation of civil society, you cannot protect people's human rights, and so this is important. We need to support human rights defenders, people who go and visit people in prisons, and will provide support. The report also deals specifically with refugees and migration. 2015 was a very significant year for that. We've looked at the issue of discrimination as well. This is something that we have since the Amsterdam Treaty, and anti-discrimination should be a focus, and that is particularly important, that there are consequences to such activities, sanctions, etc., and all of that has to be linked to human rights. We have had a significant debate. We had 866 amendments, and I would like to thank the staff that have provided us with support in dealing with those. I'd also like to thank the shadow rapporteurs for the very constructive and positive working environment. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Weidenholzer.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Weidenholzer. And now the Vice President of the Commission, the High Representative, Mrs. Mogherini.
Thank you, first of all, to the rapporteur and the shadow rapporteur. As you know, we discuss twice a year our annual human rights reports, but if I look at the long list of debates we have had together in this hemicycle over the last year, human rights have been at the centre of each and every European Parliament's plenary. And even today, a few hours ago, we listened to our Sakharov Prize laureates that I just had the honour to meet, saying we look up at Europe as a symbol of humanity. This is not simply an institutional duty we fulfil. Our work on human rights lies at the core of our foreign policy. It defines our European Union, it defines who we are. And whatever we do is about the real life of real human beings. We do understand power politics, we do understand the great games of international affairs. We do not only understand them, sometimes, often, we play our part to shape them, but we never forget that everything we do is about real people. This is the European way to foreign policy. We are not naive and we are not cynical. In the global strategy we refer to principled pragmatism, and that's our way. This will be even more important in the months and in the years to come. The decision by some countries to withdraw from the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court demonstrates that the pressure on the international system of global governance is going to be raised. There is already a growing demand for a power that stands on the side of human rights. We are more and more so an indispensable power for human rights, for multilateralism, for a rules-based global order. The report we discuss today shows once again that all institutions of this Union stand on the same side. I am glad not only that you have shown your support for our action plan on human rights, but also for our Operation Sophia, or for our new external investment plan. We agree on fundamentals, we agree on the vision, we share the view that 2016 has been a very difficult year indeed for democracy and human rights. We are all convinced that there is no sustainable development without human rights, and there is no sustainable security with fundamental freedoms. This is what the global strategy calls resilience. Our states and our societies are strong only when democracy is strong, when the debate is free and open, when human rights are respected, when the space for participation is open and guaranteed, and participation itself is active and welcomed. Human rights abuses do not make a country more stable or more secure. On the contrary, they only make societies less resilient and weaken the legitimacy of institutions. This vision is already inspiring our actions in very concrete ways, and let me make a few examples. First, the report talks about our missions and operations and the link between security and human rights. The prevention of human rights abuses is indeed becoming a key focus, a key element for our work on security. The EU Action Plan on Human Rights says that our support to our partners' security forces must be always consistent with the promotion of human rights. We are doing this in practice every single day, for instance, through also my proposal of a European framework to support security sector reform. 2017 will be the year of a mid-term review for the Action Plan, and we are already working on a daily basis to make it a meaningful review. Second, the report rightly focuses on civil society and the restrictions against freedom of expression. It is almost impossible to mention all the initiatives we have put in place to preserve and enlarge the space for pluralism and free debate. Some of you attended the annual EU NGO Forum a few days ago in Brussels. You know our dialogue with civil society organisations is constant and intense, both in our region and worldwide. And the EU for Human Rights campaign has raised awareness about human rights in Europe and beyond. Let me thank in particular, as you did, our Special Representative Stavros, who is here with me today, as he is always with me whenever we have these debates in this hemicycle. His work is making a difference every single day for so many people, and in particular for human rights activists and campaigners. You were talking about visits, dialogues, meetings. He is in strong and constant connection with me and with all our services and so many of you, our hand, our brain, our voice in handling with difficult cases, in many cases with success and results of which we are proud and we can be proud. So thank you, Stavros. In 2016, The European Instrument on Democracy and Human Rights has supported directly more than 250 human rights defenders and their families who were at risk because of their daily work. Third element, we are engaging constantly with our partners through dedicated human rights dialogue. Here I know this is a delicate chapter of our work. Yesterday, I start with the most delicate example, I met in Brussels with Bruno Rodrigues, the Foreign Minister of Cuba. Our relationship with Cuba has entered into a completely new phase, and one of the first new steps we have taken was to start a dialogue on human rights. We've had 2 rounds of that, one in Europe, one in Havana, and I believe there is no other way to make a real difference, to try and make a real difference. Engage constantly, engage tirelessly, trying to improve the situation on the ground, having frank and open discussions with our partners. Finally, we are keeping human rights and the rights of women and children in particular at the core of peace talks and reconciliation processes. Syria is constantly on our mind, and in these hours in particular, as we are receiving terrible reports from the ground. And here I would like to take the occasion of this debate to join my voice to that of the UN Secretary General that just a few hours ago underlined the obligation of all parties on the ground to protect civilians and abide by international humanitarian and human rights law, and recalling that this is particularly the responsibility of the Syrian government and its allies. Those who perpetrate war crimes will be held accountable. The priority now in these hours is to protect civilians, guarantee them safe and monitored transit to a place of safety. We all know that it is also crucial, always in Syria, but on the future, crucial to be working on protecting everyone's rights through the transition and in the transition, in the moment when a political process will be finally put in place. But let me also mention a success story, as you did, some positive examples. The peace deal in Colombia, an agreement for all the victims of conflicts, and that will provide a sound basis towards justice, reconciliation and reaching the truth. And I am honoured that Manuel Santos, the President of Colombia, was yesterday in Brussels with us at his first international visit after he received the Nobel Peace Prize. And we launched together the EU Trust Fund to accompany exactly the implementation of the agreement, the peace agreement in Colombia. So let me conclude on a positive note. Yes, the situation of human rights in the world is very serious, but there are also success stories. And wherever things are moving in the right direction, the European Union is there, engaged directly through our funds, through our delegations, through our special representative, through dialogues and diplomacy. My message for you is the same I delivered to the NGOs a few days ago. We need to be vigilant, all of us. We need to be critical when necessary, but we also need to amplify the success stories. We need to talk about real people beyond the numbers and beyond the budget lines. We need to show that the European Union is practically and concretely a force for human rights, a force for democracy and a force for good. We need our voice, your voice, to be heard also on this, more than ever. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Frau Mogherini.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Mogherini. And now, on behalf of the Development Committee, Mr. Preda for 1.5 minutes. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President. I would like to thank the rapporteur to begin with. I was rapporteur last year and I know how difficult it is. And I would like to stress the points included in the opinion from the Development Committee which I drafted this year. Development, democracy, human rights are all intrinsically linked, and I'm happy to see that this is made very clear in the report we're going to vote on tomorrow. Human rights, good governance, democracy and the rule of law are indeed crucial elements if we are to eradicate poverty and inequality, and inversely poverty and lack of equality threaten the exercise of human rights. In the Development Committee we welcome the inclusion of a chapter on development in the 2015 annual report, and we want that to be a constant practice. We also want to see genuine synchronization between human rights and all our cooperation for development, starting with implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Human rights must be a major cross-cutting element if we're to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And I would also like to stress the crucial importance of goal number 16, aimed at guaranteeing peace, justice and integration within our societies, because in the absence of peace, our development aid cannot achieve its aims and respect for human rights cannot be guaranteed. And finally, as a standing rapporteur to ensure that development policies are coherent, I would stress the use of this requirement under Article 208 of the Treaty for implementing human rights. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Preda. On behalf of the Women's Committee, Mrs. Becerra BASTERRECHEA.
Gracias, President.
Thank you, President. Madam Mogherini, the Sakharov Prize is the soul of the European Parliament. It embodies the values on which the European project is founded: respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law and human rights. It's a unique, effective, magnificent instrument. And I'd like to thank all my colleagues for having supported the candidates that we have given the prize to today, Nadia Murad and Lamia Ayi Bashar, and thank you to them for being shining beacons who light up the world. They're an example of resilience which has inspired not only me in my work as Deputy Chair of the Subcommittee on Human Rights, but all of us who are fighting for a fairer world. Nadia, you know that you have my unwavering commitment to take your cause to the International Criminal Court, because no crime against humanity should remain unpunished. We, Europe, the world, need more Nadias and more Lamayas. We need more Sakharov. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Becerra BASTERRECHEA. Now we move to the speakers on behalf of the groups, starting with Mrs. QUISTHOUDT-ROWOHL for 1.5 minutes. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President. Colleagues, I would like to start by thanking our colleague Weidenholzer. There's been a flood of draft amendments, but using the original text and those amendments, he's come up with a very consistent text, which I think was also thanks to the work with all of the shadow rapporteurs. Human rights cannot be seen as being distinct from other perspectives. It is a cross-cutting basis for all the action of the European Union and is of crucial importance, particularly for all aspects of foreign policy. And therefore, Mrs. Mogherini, I would also like to thank you for your very good words. There is a majority in this Parliament that believes that you cannot have a balanced report if you don't look at various examples or just simply pick out examples of infringements of human rights, either by individuals or by countries. We have managed this time to do what we have to do, and that is be very clear about the situation. We are very concerned, though, about persecution for religious reasons, particularly in my group, and also Christianity and persecution there. We've seen that with the attacks on the Coptic Church. One final comment, if I may, Mr. President. Unfortunately, the speaker has been cut off. Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. QUISTHOUDT-ROWOHL. Mr. Panzeri for 2 minutes.
Grazie, President.
Thank you very much indeed, President. This morning, with the awarding of the Sakharov Prize, we understood how much work still lies ahead of us. And I would like to thank our colleague Weidenholzer for his excellent work. And I would echo the applause for the commitment of the Special Representative Stavros Lambrinidis. This report should be seen as an important instrument from the European Union in support of human rights and democracy, and it should be used as a basis to improve our intervention in certain specific sectors. Now, obviously this is a very vast report, and an annual report therefore has to take a thematic report, but at the same time it also has to establish clear indicators which could highlight where the EU has improved over the preceding year and where the objectives set have been met. This report should allow us to seriously assess what we have done, particularly for certain sectors. I'm thinking, for example, of trade agreements. And we have to use this in order to shape a new vision on human rights. I believe that we still have a lot to do, but we have to do that largely by increasing our political reaction as well to these questions. And less rights means less democracy. That's what European citizens have to understand. Cooperation with countries in this field is crucial to us and our future. We have to ensure that human rights are guaranteed both inside and outside the European Union. And this has to be done with huge energy. We have to understand that human rights, that issue, is an issue which runs through all EU policy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Panzeri. The next speaker is Mr. Tannock for 2 minutes.
Reminded in this Parliament of the many atrocities and acts of human rights abuse that tragically occur throughout the world, such as in Aleppo right now as I speak. Only this morning we heard the extremely moving testimonies of this year's Sakharov laureates, Nadia Murad and Lamia Ajibashar, from the Yazidi community. What they have experienced under the brutal regime of ISIS is as evil an ideology as anybody could possibly imagine. These are personal stories, but they serve to illustrate the plight of millions of others who find themselves in similar circumstances across the globe. Member states throughout the European Union each enjoy their own histories and historical trajectories, of course. They have each moved from autocracies in the past to democracy today, enshrining the rights of all over the few, and developing legal systems that have delivered equality before the law, albeit in very different time frames. These are the principles that have delivered the civil and political freedoms and protections that we all enjoy today, along with many other economic and social rights. These are the values of the European Union: respect for human dignity and human rights, freedom, democracy, equality and the rule of law, freedom of the press and expression. It's important that we recall that it is these fundamental values and other institutions that deliver the peace and prosperity we all see in Europe and the developed world today. And it is important that we continue to be a voice in advocating those values across other parts of the world. So we fully support the human rights report in the world as it is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tannock. Now for 2 minutes, Mrs. Schaake.
Thank you, President, High Representative, Special Representative and colleagues. Today's debate about human rights in the world comes at a time of growing pressure on the universality of human rights. From the banning and intimidation of civil society to attacks on human rights defenders, journalists and bloggers, or restrictions of the free expression of LGBTIs, artists and those who demonstrate peacefully. The list is long and requires clear pushback that involves more leadership from Europe. It is difficult to be proud of Europe when we watch Aleppo fall and bombardments by Russians and Assad's planes being rewarded, when refugees fleeing this atrocious war are being fenced off and international law and human rights are discarded when they get in the way of counterterrorism efforts or quote-unquote managing migration. It is now more important than ever for us to stand unequivocally for the very values upon which our open societies are based and give meaning to those values globally. That means a more forceful and credible stance for the importance and respect for human rights. Young women such as the Sakharov Prize winners who courageously fight the horrible violence caused by Daesh have fled to Europe. But imagine the many, many, many who have spent years in refugee camps now, who've been married off, and who have absolutely no perspective. What will we tell them? We cannot be complacent and must make sure that Europe remains a beacon of freedom, a safe haven for free thinkers, and a meaningful representation of what universality of human rights is actually about. It is not only the right thing to do, but it is in our self-interest to offer perspectives for people who need them so desperately, such as in North Africa and the Middle East. And I therefore urge you, as my final comment, to avoid deals like the one made with Turkey and now being copied with countries like Mali, to avoid a situation where EU's foreign policy becomes a mere instrument of managing migration without having a clear focus on the need to defend and protect human rights. That is what we should have much more attention for and prioritize in our foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Schaake. Now, for 2 minutes, Mrs. Vergiat.
Thank you, President. I'd also like to thank our rapporteur for the efforts to reconcile so many amendments, but unfortunately I don't think the result meets the challenges in terms of human rights and their necessary universality, or how the EU should react on this issue. I think we've never had such a long report, and the longer it is, the more contradictions you see, the less focus there is on priorities, and I'm particularly sorry about that. I'm particularly critical about the migration section. How can you unconditionally support readmission agreements, the Khartoum process, the Trust Fund for Africa, when they are focused on countries where human rights are abused, as happens in the Horn of Africa and the Middle East, and when those agreements are first and foremost decided on the basis of the number who arrive and ask for asylum in the EU? What are insufficient return policies doing in human rights documents? Furthermore, in spite of the expressed determination not to focus on a particular country, you find the same concerns time and time again, and the same omissions time and time again. Nothing about the Gulf countries, nothing about Israel, even a refusal to focus on the most important countries in Latin America. There are we have a trade unionist who was murdered in Colombia. A quarter of human rights defenders are murdered in Latin America. So this is not very satisfactory, and I want to express my reservations on the annex of the list of prisoners of conscience once again. Madam High Representative, I don't share your optimism. I fear that those contradictions...
Thank you very much, Mrs. Vergiat. Now for 2 minutes, Mrs. Lochbihler.
Herr Vorsitzender.
Thank you very much. This year's report is more extensive but also more progressive than so far in a number of important areas of policy, and I would like to thank Mr. Weidenholzer, the rapporteur, for that. And there are issues of relating to human rights, making issues more binding, and also the use of armed drones, the fight against human trafficking, and these issues are all given further attention than in the past. We're calling for continuity in human rights policy. On the refugee policy of the EU, we have to see that in 2015, but also in 2016, there is no policy area in which the EU is falling so short, and the shifting of responsibility didn't gain a majority, and the lack of policy is at the expense of those that Europe should be helping, and is in contradiction with our commitment to human rights. The International Court of Justice will have all of our support in order to be able to work efficiently. And now governments from South Africa, Burundi have decided to leave the ICJ, and there are already exceptions, but this is a very contradictory situation, and we should welcome the fact that the President of Gambia is considering changing that decision. And finally, we're setting rules for the export of instruments that can be used for torture. But I would call for a comparable initiative at global level. European efforts are not enough. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mrs. Lochbihler. And now for 1 minute, Mr. Carver.
As we discuss human rights, by virtue of my own Romani Gypsy heritage, I wish to highlight the issues facing our Roma, Gypsy and traveller communities. Anti-Gypsyism is a worrying global trend and has even been described to me by a leading human rights campaigner as the last acceptable face of racism today. Mr. President, the time has come to act beyond the usual platitudes and lip service, and for real action to be taken at member state level. Every week, news reports highlight increasing attacks against our RGT communities, including murders taking place only last month. That is how serious the issue has become. In my country, aside of access to healthcare and education, there are many other issues facing our Gypsy and traveller communities, not least the distinct shortage of both permanent and temporary stopping sites and the need for local authorities to live up to their legal obligations in this regard. Last year's wicked changes to planning legislation, legally redefining the legal personality of a traveller, would not have been allowed to happen to any other ethnic minority. Our government should hold their heads in shame. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carver. And now, for 2 minutes, Mr. Rebega.
Domnule președinte, stimați colegi.
Thank you very much, President. The situation of human rights in 2015, which is covered in this report, shows the shortcomings of European policies in these areas. There are many projects and many decisions which are set out in the report, and they show us that there are still many violations of human rights. But despite all of the international organizations that we have, we can't talk about progress from 1 year to the next in the area of human rights, and that shows that the mechanisms that we have aren't working, or neither in the area of prevention. It's a very shifting concept. Sometimes it's difficult to evaluate things, and sometimes there are issues of interpretation, particularly when people are of bad faith. And I want to talk about education, for instance. Unfortunately, the EU uses 2 different measures when evaluating. And if this is really just a question of rhetoric, then we won't be able to make progress, and everything that we do will not be effective. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Rebega. And now Mr. Voigt for 1 minute.
President.
Thank you, Mr. President. The global human rights situation. Well, I'll repeat once again the question Mrs. Fergie asked, but Mr. Weidenholzer isn't here. Why, with these reports, the Gulf states, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Israel, why are they all exempted? Then there's another thing I'd like to mention. We are quite rightly discussing the fact that in Turkey the death sentence should be reintroduced. But why are we talking about it being removed in Europe? Why are we not saying that the United States have a central area which is actually in Europe, where people are killed through a mechanism? Basically, the United States actually admit that they have killed many people. The UN statistics talk about lots of people being killed as collateral damage. Why isn't this mentioned? Why isn't mentioned in this type of report?
Thank you very much. Now for 1.5 minutes, Mr. Gibb.
Bardzo, panie przewodniczący. Dziękuję sprawozdawcy.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to thank the rapporteur and shadow rapporteurs for their work. It's very difficult to describe all of these events throughout the entire year. Over 800 amendments means that colleagues wanted to include everything in that report. It was a difficult year because of non-observance of human rights, the war, especially, unfortunately, not observing the right to live. Today, we have awarded 2 women. 2, Yazizjana Murati and Bashar, were awarded with the Sakharov Prize for their freedom of thought, freedom of speech. But also, it was an expression of identifying ourselves with those who were persecuted. It is important to mention how important it is to perhaps disvalue all those acts of violence. In Article 148, for years, it seems that Christians are the most frequently persecuted individuals. In Article 132, the report says that the Parliament called upon the Security Council of the United Nations Organization to recognize those crimes on Yazids as crimes against humanity, as genocide. Mr. Chairman, I think that these are only a few examples from the catalogue that we should be speaking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. GRZYB. And now for 3 minutes, Mrs. Valenciano.
Firstly, I'd like to congratulate my colleague Josef WEIDENHOLZER for the excellent work that he's done on this report, which was very difficult. The words of Nadia Murad and of Lamia Hadji Bashar are echoing around this chamber still today, and they are a great responsibility for all of us. Last Saturday we were celebrating the Human Rights Day, 68 years after the member states joined the Human Rights Declaration, and 68 years later, unfortunately, the news is not very good. The Declaration of Human Rights has still not been fulfilled. In 2016 and 2015, which is the one the report refers to, have not been very good for human rights. There are still war crimes and crimes against humanity which remain unpunished. The International Criminal Court is being weakened rather than strengthened because several countries are withdrawing from the Statute of Rome. We're not managing to get humanitarian international law met, and there is a virtually global trend towards greater repression of civil society, and there's very little humanitarian aid, and it doesn't reach everyone. But if there's something that will mark 2015 in Europe, it is the refugee crisis. There have never been so many refugees that we haven't been able to help. Europe, in spite of all of its work, did not rise to the challenge. Thousands of these refugees didn't survive, drowned in the Mediterranean, and nevertheless, in spite of all of that, as we heard this morning, the EU remains a point of reference for many people in terms of justice and solidarity. It's a model for the world, and that's why I talk about responsibility. And so this Parliament will continue demanding that the EU should not weaken in its fight for human rights. Before political and business interests beat the human rights priority, we must ensure that we are effective in defending human rights. I want to congratulate Mr. Lambrinidis on his excellent work. It's not very often recognized, but it's very good work, and also your work, High Representative. Don't weaken. You're doing a good job. You too make the European Union a better European Union.
Thank you very much. And now for 1.5 minutes, Mr. Belder. Thank you very much, President. In paragraph 148 of the Weidenholzer report, there are 10 words, and I will quote them. Christian refugees are systematically persecuted for religious reasons, but behind these few words is a world of fear, suffering, and traumatic experiences. I was more afraid in my German reception center than in Syria, says a 29-year-old Christian refugee. Jihadis from our home country were living under the same roof. Just a few weeks ago, Open Doors Germany published an inquiry in which they listed 743 violations against the rights of Christian refugees living in German asylum centers. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Death threats, violence, and violence against women, not to mention verbal violence. They are called impure unbelievers and are told that they deserve no shelter. They're told they cannot use the shared kitchens or showers. Every day I was threatened, tells a Christian refugee with her back to the camera. And once again, she is being persecuted. And what must she think of the right to religious freedom and democracy in Europe? We all need to come up with answers to these questions.
Thank you
very much, Mr. Belder. Now, for 1.5 minutes, Mr. AUŠTREVIČIUS.
High Representative, Special Representative, colleagues. Over the last few years, violations of fundamental human rights have become systematic just across EU's borders, in countries that enjoyed being the EU's partners, strategic partners, or even candidate countries just a while ago. In Russia, Azerbaijan, or Turkey, for instance, the space of civil society has been shrinking, in some cases dramatically. Harassment, imprisonment, and disappearances of independent journalists, political opposition, and human rights defenders have become everyday's news. Just as more faked elections are the news every few years. In some countries, like Belarus, things have been fixed for quite some time already when it comes to human rights. Cleansed and frozen. This is the current status of the civil society in Belarus. Once called the last dictator in Europe, Lukashenko can only celebrate today, as restrictive measures are removed. At the same time, globally, in the United Nations, we observe another crisis of decision-making. In fact, the veto right has become a tool of defending dictatorships, a cover to make the crimes against humanity close to legal. With immense propaganda and manipulation and false information on the top of all these, we are very close to have cornerstones of the modern world order demolished. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. AUŠTREVIČIUS. And now, for 1 minute, Mr. Urban Crespo. 4,500 deaths in the Mediterranean, people trying to get to our borders. 4,500 reasons for it to be difficult for European institutions to talk about human rights, outsourcing of our borders with shameful agreements like the EU-Turkey agreement, turning the other cheek when we see systematic abuse of human rights by Erdogan's government. Yesterday they arrested 200 HDP members. We have a strategy of trade penetration by EU multinationals in third countries, the use of debt as a weapon of mass destruction of social rights, millions of people suffering energy poverty, which kills thousands of people in countries like Spain every year. We have to end this false rhetoric of defending human rights. The best way to defend human rights is to practice human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what we must do, practice human rights.
Mim, you have a blue card. Would you accept it from our colleague Otto von Lambsdorff? Yeah.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Präsident. Ich habe auch
Thank you, President. I listened very carefully, and one question arises. Do you really believe that it's intellectually, morally, and politically correct that budget policy, austerity, etc., should be mixed up with torture, lack of rule of law, and religious persecution? Do you really think that that's a policy with which you can actually achieve something, that you just throw everything into this thing? You know, the victims of genuine infringements of human rights, aren't you cocking a snook at them, basically, when you say this type of thing?
A la verdad.
That is untrue. The austerity policy has created death and inequality in most of the southern countries of EU. Juan Pablo Borjoslaski, the UN rapporteur, in his 2015 report says that the austerity policy and memoranda signed with Greece have undermined legislation on human rights, both the European and UN legislation, and that's in a UN report.
Hautala, 1 minute.
Mrs. Hautala, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. High Representative, Special Representative, I would like to take this opportunity to come back to the question of the genocide of the Yazidis. Today, Nadia Murad said that Daesh took our honor and the European Parliament, with the award, has given it back. And Lamia Arji Bashar had said that criminals must be brought to justice. Now, I came back to the answer that you have given to about 100 MEPs on the 30th of May on this issue, where we insist that you would act so that the EU recognises the treatment of Yazidis as genocide. And you list a long list of prerequisites for doing that. But my conviction, and I believe that the European Parliament is united on this, is that it's time for the EU to accelerate this process and to look for the possibilities to call it what we think it is, a genocide. And this, of course, puts obligations to the EU to act on the grounds of the Genocide Convention. So I really hope that you will look again into this issue.
Mulțumim, domnul Corrao, 2 minute.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Corrao. 2 minutes.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you very much indeed, President. I would like to particularly thank the rapporteur for the excellent work. The annual report this year, I think, clearly deals with very, very important issues and has managed to highlight the most current pressing issues, issues that can be called cross-cutting, and where we are called upon to be more effective in our intervention, also in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals established in the Agenda 2030. I particularly welcome the parts on the defence and guarantees of the rights of indigenous peoples, and the recommitment to fight for freedom for everyone in a situation of peace and solidarity. I'd also like to stress the part on migrants, refugees, asylum seekers and the internally displaced persons, because I think that this represents the greatest challenge of our times, on which the entire credibility of the European Union is at stake. Also, the section on trade, business and human rights is very important. This is dealt with in detail in the corporate liability report, of which I was the rapporteur. I think we need to attach more attention to the question of multinationals and their respect for human rights. Now, obviously, some other issues have been looked at elsewhere, but when we talk about safeguarding human rights, there are different areas and aspects which can be distinguished, but what links them all together is that we have to defend and promote and act with humanity. Now it remains to be seen whether what we have promoted in words will actually be translated into acts which are just as laudable and effective. Thank you.
Domnul BRIOIS, 1 minute.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. BRIOIS now for 1.5 minutes.
Oui, chers collègues.
Dear colleagues, it's amusing to see you debate human rights in an institution which harasses and persecutes those who committed the crime of being Eurosceptics. Just a few hours ago, you voted on the Richard Corbett provisions, which will further restrict the freedom of expression of members of the European Parliament. It's not just a question of putting a paper in a ballot box, but it's the capacity of a people to determine their own sovereignty, but the loss of our legislative sovereignty and loss of control over budgets and territory is undermining the fundaments of democracy in the European Union. How can you dare to speak about democracy when you're agreeing on things like TTIP behind people's backs, and you're imposing them without any consultation? How can you talk about human rights when you have delivered Libya to Islamists by supporting Gaddafi? These same peoples who are introducing Sharia law and massacring people. How can you talk about fundamental rights when the President of the Commission, Mr. Juncker, gave a wonderful tribute to Fidel Castro, who I would recall is responsible for the imprisonment and death of thousands of dissidents? It's a variable geometry that you're using. And Europe should stop moralizing others.
Would you accept a blue card for Mrs. Valenciano? Yes? Okay, Mrs. Valenciano.
C'est une curiosité. Comment?
That's interesting. How do you dare to compare your sense of being a victim in this chamber with the serious breaches of human rights that we're talking about this afternoon? How dare you talk about your position as if it were the same as that of people who are suffering persecution and death? Are you not ashamed, dear colleague?
Le début d'une dictature.
The start of a dictatorship is always with the type of decisions that you're talking about, opposing people from expressing themselves freedom. And harassment is something that the Front National is subject to. I'm sorry to disappoint you.
1 minute.
1 minute. This report, President, I think is a laughable handbook. Obviously, he talks about the populists as well, but this report talks about free thought, free conscience and free religion. But in Greece and in Europe, if you say that you're a nationalist, you said that you are a fascist. If you're Christian, Islamophobic. And, you know, you're accused of racism as well. If you talk about nation, you're not showing solidarity and you want to control. He talks about respecting democracy and elections. Well, that's, if you look at the reactions of the political elite in Europe, they've turned around and spoken to the UK about Brexit, the Americans for the election of Trump. Look what's going on there. What's this, hypocrisy or a different interpretation of democracy? And finally, he talks about combating discrimination as well. Well, basically, I think that the speaker has been interrupted.
Dear Chairman, in its global strategy, the EU has committed to act globally to address the root causes of conflict and poverty and to promote human rights. In line with this commitment, this annual report reiterates that human rights remain a priority in our external policies, but they are increasingly under threat worldwide. At the hands of the authoritarian regimes, the space for civil society is shrinking and violence against defenders is increasing. Individuals are persecuted for their faith, the Christians still being the most harassed religious community globally in places like Iraq, Syria and Pakistan. In China, in a climate of fear, prominent rights defenders are harassed, tortured and go missing. Uyghur scholar Ilham Tohti remains in jail. Tibetans live in constant fear for their existence. Prominent lawyers in China, such as Jiang Tianyong, have gone missing in an ongoing widespread detention. Considering the current migration crisis in Europe, it is worth mentioning that the report distinguishes between migrants and refugees in accordance with adequate legal procedures. Our report echoes our strong commitment in European values and universal human rights.
Rodrigues, 1 minut și 30 de secunde.
1 minute for Rodrigues.
Thank you, President. High Representative, dear colleagues, this report is a diagnosis of the life of men, women, children and old people, people who are humiliated, wounded and killed, people who needed protection and have been left alone, people who had worse, much worse luck than us, have been victims of their governments. But it also shows us how we're moving forward, our improving rationality, and how we respect human rights, and how central it is to the EU's external policy. And that's why we need to put the EU framework strategy in place for human rights and democracy. We need to give a clear signal of the EU's fight against all forms of discrimination. We believe in religious freedom, in gender equality, respect for minority groups. We need better and more coordinated welcoming of migrants, and we need to create legal tools for that so that we can recognise others and their freedom. This is what actually Europe means.
Składam hołd ofiarom stanu.
I want to pay homage to the victims of the martial law in Poland. Back then, each and every day of that December yielded new crimes and new victims. In spite of all this, the European Commission has huge problems with protecting human rights both within and without the EU. We have another politically motivated debate about Poland. Thank you very much.
Domnul Weigl, 1 minut și 30 de secunde.
Mr. Weigl, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. The annual report on violations of human rights is a potentially very strong tool that we have. If the Helsinki conference looks at a violation and has given rise to changes, and we have to see that we're not meeting expectations despite the scope of the report. It's not stressing the very difficult situation we find ourselves in. We're leaving people alone even though they have fears about the future. We need to look at the sources of conflict, and colleagues, we need to be more specific when we talk about human rights, and we need to be on the side of the weak rather than the powerful.
Human rights are one of the two focal points of the actions of the new UN Secretary General António Guterres. In this context, the EU human rights policy is extremely important at the United Nations. the report, though very extensive, is still missing some important issues. The migration part has no reference to EU's efforts to exert pressure on the rich oil states of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Wouldn't it be logical for the many refugees from Syria and Iraq, mostly Sunnis, to be welcomed by their wealthy neighbors rather than by Lebanon and Jordan? What I'm also missing is any word about the USA. Many US states still use capital punishment, and they have a large proportion of their population behind bars. I believe that the European Parliament can also protect many people in the world. Thank you.
1 minute și 30 de secunde.
Mrs. von Storch, 1.5 minutes.
Herr Präsident, vielen Dank.
Thank you, President. We are talking about human rights in the world and the EU's role in this. The EU stands up for protector of human rights in the world as a state, and Mrs. Mogherini is not a state, though. Mrs. Mogherini is not a foreign minister and never will become one. You know, with apparently trying to establish canons for human rights, and some people are saying that basically abortion is a human right. Even the Christian Democrats have been raising this. Mrs. ROWOHL was just saying that the Christian Democrats are particularly in favour of supporting and protecting Christian minorities in the world. Yesterday I asked for an amendment of the agenda, indeed, and I asked for a debate about the attacks against the Christian minority in Egypt. Now, the Christian Democrats actually abstained on that. Mr. Lambsdorff voted in favour, but the Christian Democrats abstained. So that's all about that. So apparently we have to act as if we are the perfect students in respect of human rights. And, you know, I think we should have a look at what we're doing before we lay down provision for the rest of the world.
Bay, 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Bay. 1 minute. Well, we witnessed the awarding of the Sakharov Prize, but this is not stopping massacres. You're encouraging the destabilization of non-secular countries, and I'm thinking about what's happening with the Armenian church in Syria as well. And a volunteer told us that there are only about 3 square kilometers less, and the civilians are being prevented from but you've continued to support these rebels aligned with Al-Qaeda, and Laurenţiu even said that they were doing good work. But there's going to be a move in Raqqa. We have to prevent the jihadis from coming into Turkey and Europe, but we have to break the ties and
Thank you very much. We're giving a voice to the victims today, and I want to focus on one of the worst violations of human rights I know, which is terrorism. Terrorism uses brutal violence against civilians for political, ideological or religious purposes. Terrorism attacks the essence of human rights, which are security and human dignity. It destroys the supreme right, which is the right to life. So I consider that one of the priorities of EU policies on human rights in the world should be fighting terrorism and promoting the obligation that all states have to protect and keep safe their people. The international community must take fully into account the rights of victims of terrorism, and one of the most important of those is the right to justice. Terrorists must be taken to international courts to answer for crimes against humanity. Impunity, whether we're talking about religious, ethnic, nationalist terrorism, is a violation of human rights. over 300 crimes of the terrorist organization ETA have not been punished. They shouldn't prescribe. We have 2 people today who have seen all of the members of their families killed by Daesh, and they should pay for the members of the terrorists should pay for their crimes.
Mulțumesc, domnule președinte. La orizontul anului 2000 există puțină speranță pentru o lume.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, there is very little hope for a better and more peaceful world in the future. War, violence, repression are on the agenda in many continents, and therefore many people have to flee. 2015 was a year full of challenges for the EU and the international community against the backdrop of instability and the conflict in the Middle East, in Asia and in Africa, and because of the refugee crisis, but also because of the terrorist attacks on civilians. This is a paradox. The states want to become increasingly repressive in combating terrorism, and that's an argument for mass surveillance and limitation of human rights. But on the other hand, this is also the reason why more people are fighting for their rights. I would like to congratulate the rapporteur, Mr. Weidenholzer, on this very good report. It's a very balanced report, and I hope that this report really will contribute to human rights being genuinely implemented in the world and freedoms and liberties being respected. And I hope that this will ensure that human rights are at the very focus of the EU's links with third countries. Mrs. McAvey, 1 minute.
În Turcia stau în închisori aproape 40.000.
In Turkey, over 40,000 people are in prison and over 100,000 people have lost their jobs. People are dying every day. People are disappearing and we don't know why. There's no information about them. Russia is bombing in civilians and hospitals in Syria. In Ukraine, there are over 1 million people who have had to flee as a result of the violence in the country. In China, there are a lot of politicians who've said that human rights aren't important, and people have been put into prison. 300 activists just in 2015. And then we talk about bilateral agreements, trade agreements, and all sorts of things with all of the countries that I've just mentioned. If the EU is to have an external policy that really defends human rights and democracy, we need to put that into practice.
Mr. Lambsdorff. Thank you, President. We are debating human rights here today in the European Parliament. The leftist and rightist extremists say that we shouldn't be doing this. They're saying that some say that we couldn't have achieved what needed to be achieved through the class struggle. You know, the other side come forward with their arguments. Of course, the European Union is not perfect. Everyone knows that. We here know it more than anybody else. But this report addresses this very clearly. Citizens' rights is the basis for human rights being able to be enjoyed and respected. We know there are problems with citizens' rights in the EU as well. Is press freedom respected across the board? No. Independent justice? No. Have we got pluralism, protection of poverty, etc.? Is it all guaranteed as we'd like it? No, it isn't. And that's why it's correct that we, within the EU, look at member states such as Hungary and Poland and ask them not to continue down the path they've started out upon, because if we become incredible in the EU, then we can't talk against persecution, slavery, torture, out-of-court killings as well. We cannot actually speak out against that in the rest of the world, and that's why it's so important, you know, citizens' rights and then human rights. There are two very specific things that we can do about this. We have to look at the basic rights agenda in Vienna and ask there that people can speak out against steps taken by our own member states, but we also have to support Mr. Lambrinidis and those who will follow him as well, so that they become more strongly rooted in the institutions of the European Union.
From Mr. Wierzchowski, and the second one from Mr. Jurek.
With pleasure.
So, Mr. Wierzchowski.
Thank you very much, dear sir. You're very inclined to criticize other countries. This is not the first time for you, but it would be just and fair to start with your own country. What can you tell us about the state of human rights in your country? Is it so good as could be deducted from your statement?
Would you accept the second question from Mr. Jurek, and then you will give an answer to both of them? Mr. Jurek.
I support what Mr. Wierzchowski said. What would you say to the fact that in your countries children are not allowed to speak Polish if they have German and Polish parents, and Jugendamt officials think this is inconvenient for the work of your institutions? What would you say? In very many Länder in Germany, the stipulations of the Polish-German intergovernmental agreement are not fulfilled. These stipulations guarantee German citizens of Polish origin the right to guard their culture. So please take care of human rights in your country, sir.
Well, I will be the last person to claim that everything is perfect in Germany within the framework of the Universal Periodic Review from the United Nations. For example, the prisons are criticized in Germany because they don't meet UN standards. It's correct, and we have to be very open about that. But then there's another problem with the question of people who speak Polish. It's a question of the so-called minorities. The Danish minority in Germany may speak Danish in the schools. Of course, Polish citizens can speak Polish as well, and other minorities as well. But we discuss openly about this. We have a good dialogue, and we want to retain that as well, so that we remain credible within the EU. But, you know, if we want also to speak out for human rights to the outside world as well.
Minute.
Gracias.
Thank you. It's great to have a report on breaches of human rights in the rest of the world, because obviously in the EU human rights are not breached at all. But really, in the EU, those in charge of the EU, they feel human rights are a secondary issue. They don't suspend association agreements with Israel or Morocco in spite of crimes against the Palestinian and Sahrawi people. They still are working with Saudi Arabia. They signed the agreement with Turkey so that they would take charge of the refugee, and they are not speaking out about the killing of Kurds. And so a binding treaty does not have the support of the EU. So the reports are great, but they don't actually take into account any of these very important issues.
Representative, Special Representative, let me start by thanking our rapporteurs for their commitment and this annual report, which covers a wide range of issues of utmost importance. I have in mind advancement of democracy, rule of law, universality and indivisibility of human rights, the very basics of the EU CFSP and other policies with an external dimension. The report points out attempts to shrink the space of civil society, limitations on freedoms of assembly or expression. It pays particular attention to women, children, also new challenges like antimicrobacterial resistance and right to health care, and EU human rights policies in this regard. It stresses also that trade and human rights must go hand in hand. It is true, the report keeps a horizontal focus, and to my mind it is one of its shortcomings. EU representatives act in concrete countries. They need our support, and I do not see the point of avoiding names of the countries or those responsible for the atrocities in our annual report. And it is not at all about naming and shaming. It is first of all about victims, people like Nadia Murad and Lamia Aji Bashar. Now it looks like we tend to care about image and prestige of dictators and human rights violators, try not to upset them instead of speaking on behalf of those oppressed, denied of the rights and freedoms. Finally, Venezuela, Cuba, Russia, Iran, China should be in our report. Thank you.
1 minut și 30 de secunde.
Annual report reiterates Parliament's call for the EU institutions and Member States to place human rights at the centre of our relations with all third countries, including strategic partners. But Parliament continues to be bluntly disregarded, and not just in Syria and Iraq, as Lamia and Nadia today pointed out. One latest evidence is the European Council's silence and the Commission's perfunctory criticism over the recent arrest of Professor Merera Gudina, a prominent Oromo opposition leader who is being tortured in Ethiopia and continues to be denied access to a lawyer. His crime was to speak at the public hearing hosted by me in this Parliament on the situation in Ethiopia, with exiled Oromo athlete Faiza Lileza and Professor Bahano Nega said to be a terrorist by the real terrorist, the Ethiopian government. The External Action Service and the Commission have yet to join the European Parliament's President in demanding the immediate release of Professor Merera Gudina. The EU cannot be credible about human rights and the rule of law when it prepares to further finance, via the Migration Compact, the undemocratic regime in Ethiopia, already Africa's top recipient of our development aid. A country under state of emergency where thousands of peaceful protesters were massacred, assassinated, or languish in jails crowded with journalists and other prisoners of conscience. A country from which thousands have to flee as refugees and migrants. 88,000 this year alone into war-ravaged Yemen, according to UNHCR. How many Ethiopian citizens will have to die, and how will Ethiopia have to come close to civil war to end the EU's complicity with this brutal and callous dictatorship?
Piotrowski, 1 minute.
Mr. Piotrowski.
We've been debating the respect of human rights and democracy in the world for 2015. It counts altogether 50 pages. In point 148, the European Parliament emphasizes that Christians are most notoriously persecuted religious group in the majority of countries, including Europe. And this is what we have emphasized in this chamber oftentimes. It is a pity that we were unable to improve the situation of Christians in the world. Instead of, despite the fact that Christians are defined as most highly persecuted group of religious people, there is some asymmetric treatment of people. For instance, the LGBT are devoted more time than Christians. In point 124, 125, and 126, there's reference to that. Many MEPs may vote against the entire report because of that. Thank you.
Kósa, 1 minut 30 de secunde.
Mr. Kósa, 1 minute 30 seconds.
Örömmel állapítom meg, hogy a jelentés egy egész fejezetet szentel a fogyatékossággal élő személyek helyzetén.
The report has a whole chapter on the situation of disabled persons and looking at the projects and their effectiveness. It is important that we include representatives of associations that represent disabled people in the decision-making process, because no decision should be taken on disabled persons without their involvement. I think it is important that we follow the UN Convention on this matter, and we need to create a number of projects that will provide support to disabled persons and make it possible for them to be integrated in society, into the society that they live in. We shouldn't be exporting these solutions. What we should be doing is strengthening local communities. We need to ensure that people are able to participate where they live, and we need to ensure that the funding gets to those who need it.
Domnul Boștinaru nu este. Dacă vine, o să primească cuvântul. Domnul Halla-aho.
Mr. Boștinaru will take the floor later. So now 1 minute to Mr. Halla-aho.
Thank you, Mr. President. The report contains much that is good and that we can support. Unfortunately, the section on immigrants and refugees to some extent repeats failed ideas, insists on solutions that do not work, and avoids touching the core problems. The report, as usual, calls for more legal channels to Europe for people of all skill levels, including the least qualified. I think this is irresponsible. Western Europe should have learned by now what happens when you import large numbers of people who do not have the skills that are needed in a post-industrial society. You get segregation, crime, religious radicalism, and chaos. We cannot just manage the problem by, for example, relocating irregular migrants. We should focus more on reducing drastically the number of economic migrants who arrive and stay by means of a more effective returns policy and external border control, tighter rules on family reunification and subsidiary protection, and so on. Thank you very much.
Domnul Milan Mon.
Mr. Milan Mon for 1 minute 30.
Thank you, President. Once again, we're debating the report on human rights and democracy around the world. It's a very special year because in 2016 we're commemorating the 50th anniversary of the UN declarations on civil rights. The EU is a community of values and principles, people who respect human rights, democracy and the rule of law, which occupy a central space. And they're also part of their external action, and in that spirit we today awarded the prize, the Sakharov prizes, and this morning we heard the very moving words of 2 young victims of the repugnant Daesh. We are going backwards in terms of human rights around the world. There are atrocities being committed every day in Syria, so the Union must be unequivocal, particularly when hearing voices which wrongly negate the universality of human rights and talk about it being rights being an internal issue which depend on national sovereignty. So the Union must continue to promote their respect and defend the dignity of individuals, particularly when we're seeing such dreadful terrorist attacks. And let me finish by condemning the dreadful attacks on Cairo and Istanbul this weekend.
Consari, 1 minut și 30 de...
Mrs. Jaakonsaari, 1 minute 30.
Mr. President, the plenary session here in Strasbourg is a good example of how widely the European Parliament tackles human rights issues. First, we awarded the Sakharov Prize to the Yazidi women today, and then we have on the agenda Uzbekistan, the forced labor used in their cotton fields, and the Eastern Partnership countries and the human rights violations in those countries. And I think this is a good example of how human rights are constantly on the agenda of the European Union. They are our heart, because the European Union lives through its values. There are 2 things I wanted to mention. As Mr. Lambsdorff said, there are some concerning developments inside the EU in terms of rule of law, and the other thing is that the EU countries are exporting weapons to crisis areas.
Domnul Jurek, 1 minut.
Mr. Jurek, 1 minute.
Panie Przewodniczący, Szanowni Państwo.
Presidents, ladies and gentlemen, it is very rare that you hear such cynical and curious ideas. For instance, to prevent mortality of infants by easy access to so-called safe abortion. How can a democracy work if we see false arguments which derail our debate? Thank you.
Thank you very much, President. Madam Mogherini, Mr. Lambrinidis, we are debating last year's human rights situation. But just now, at this moment, Syrian government soldiers are slaughtering civilians in Aleppo. So-called solution there has been reached by trampling on all possible human rights and rules. And the message we get today from Aleppo is might is making right. The EU's role, obviously, is not only to take care of the refugees, what we are doing, but its role is to prevent these tragedies to happen as far as possible and resolve the crisis. We remain, unfortunately, divided and hesitant. Today, Sakharov Prize winners Nadia and Lamia called once again to take to justice those who have committed crimes against humanity. EU's role should be to initiate something, to implement this. In the past 6 years, the European Parliament has called in three resolutions and 2 recommendations to sanction individuals directly linked to the deaths of Sergei Magnitsky. Why has there been no action taken on this so far? US, Canada, and now my own country, Estonia, have enforced the Magnitsky list. By doing the same, the EU could possibly make a difference. What we need. Last week, Mikhail Kasyanov said that the best way to help Russian people, and that applies also to Syrian people, for the EU is to stay true to its own values and principles, not to implement them in deeds, not only in words.
Mr. Kelam, would you accept a blue card from Monsieur Le Breton? Yes? Okay. Vous avez la parole.
You have the floor. Mr. Kelam, colleagues, quite correctly, you mentioned the 2 Yazidi women who were so brave, who received the Sakharov Prize, and who have been the victims of Daesh. But, of course, yes, we have to support them, but don't you think that you are undermining this if you think that, or you're playing it down if you think that we should reproach Putin and Assad for what they're doing in Aleppo? Let's not lose sight of the fact that they are actually fighting Daesh that persecuted these 2 women. So don't you think that maybe you should be a little bit more nuanced in what you say?
Thank you, colleague, for this question. I think this is a very risky approach to differentiate between evils. There can be manifold evils. We think about Hitler and Stalin in World War II, and to ally with Stalin against Hitler brought about the slavery of East European nations for 50 years.
Thank you. Mrs. Kienge, 1 minute 30.
Thank you, President. This morning, the Parliament awarded its highest recognition for the fight for human rights, awarding 2 outstanding young women. Their testimony, their story reached out to our hearts and confirmed to us how violation and discrimination against women and young girls has increased over recent years, particularly in war zones and under authoritarian regimes. Slavery, exploitation, domestic violence, sexual violence, use sexual violence as an a weapon in war. Violence against women, though, is expressed in other ways as well. Harassment, bullying, intimidation and discrimination, for example. Europe has to remain a model for the living together of cultures and people in this world. Nadia and Aramia reminded us that in their speech. It's unacceptable that in many countries around the world today, women still do not enjoy the same fundamental freedoms and the same economic, social, cultural, civil and political rights as men. Europe has the instruments to promote democratic rights in the world, and what we call for is more ambition in our policies to protect the rights and dignity of the women who are victims of all forms of violence around the world. And we have to continue to speak out against those who commit genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes, including those linked to sexual violence. Thank you.
1 minute.
Mrs. Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. President. Every society is as free as its most vulnerable members. A stable society will find a way to protect such social groups and create circumstances in which they can contribute to society. In the past, members of minorities have enriched Croatian society significantly. However, the way in which minorities are valued today has unfortunately been reduced to the material rights enjoyed by minority political representatives and a narrow circle of people loyal to them who are using political blackmail to get their hands on money from the budget. This mistaken approach to valuing minorities has led to the absurd situation in which minorities, in spite of the many positive examples in history, are not seen as those who enrich society, but rather as those who unjustly take what does not belong to them. Members of minorities must be protected, but in the case of Croatia, they must primarily be protected from the individuals purporting to represent them, but who are just using them to further their own personal interests.
Thank you, Chair. Esteemed High Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, our annual report holds a number of good recommendations. However, I'm afraid that we cannot see the woods on account of the trees. Page 32 of the report is about children's rights, but we are not bringing ceasefire or answers to children who will die in Aleppo today or tomorrow. Why are they dying, and whose fault is it? We talk about human rights and human rights breaches. Let us start acting and let us stop the worst atrocities. Let us tackle actions which, in the first place, should not have taken place in the 21st century. If we look at who is to blame, we can clearly see that we must inhale new life into the UN Security Council. As long as a country responsible for breaches of the international humanitarian law holds the veto right, we will continue to remain powerless eyewitnesses of new atrocities. Russia and Mr. Assad must accept responsibility for their actions while 80,000 people are caught in a vicious circle of death. The extent of human rights breaches is the largest in decades. The international law principle of responsibility for the breaches is a sine qua non existential condition for the present and future generations.
Domnul Zala,
Mr. Zala.
The narrative is that the EU can only be a genuine strategic actor if it embraces realpolitik and cynicism. It is a dangerous and false narrative and a false dilemma, whether in the context of the refugee crisis or relations with Turkey or with Russia or security in northern and western Africa. Ultimately, the root causes of European insecurity lie in gross abuse of human rights and failing governance in our neighbourhood. We don't need another endless debate about the trade-off between strategic interests and human rights. Instead, we need a more strategic approach to promoting human rights. The EU must seize the initiative and formulate a positive agenda, such as pushing a new global architecture to manage migration flows and ensure rights of refugees. In the same way, the EU pushed for R2P, arms control, climate change, transitional justice and other issues. After the US elections, the EU may be the last global actor able and willing to fight for universal principles. Thank you.
Mulțumim. Domnul Jazdowski, un minut.
Mr. Jazdowski, 1 minute.
Mr. Chairman, colleagues, one remark and one polemic. I am happy that we are focusing on religious freedom, on prosecution against Christian, on refugee rights, and on human trafficking. This is a barbarian act of the 21st century. But our report and our discussion should not be biased, and I would like to refer to Mr. Lambsdorff, who never answered my question and that of Mr. Jurek. In Poland, that has been so viciously criticized by you, we have a very strong support and protection of minorities. Germans have their own parliamentary representation and their languages are protected. So I'd like to invite you to come to Poland to see good patterns and models that you could use in Germany and also that could be used in Europe.
Adaktusson, 1 minut.
Mr. Adaktusson, 1 minute 30.
Herr talman, idag firas Sankta Lucia.
Today we celebrate Saint Lucia in Sweden, and Saint Lucia brings a light to the darkest part of the year. Centuries ago, Saint Lucia. Yesterday, 25 other victims fell, and I think that brings us to consider a persecution of Christians the persecution against Christians is one of the most widespread violations of human rights. And I suggested that in this report we look more into the issues of freedom of religious expression. And many of the points that we raised have been included in the report, and I'd like to thank Josef WEIDENHOLZER for his work. It's been excellent, but I would also like to call upon the House to always consider freedom of religion as an integral part of human rights. And as the UN Special Representative said, if there is no freedom of religion, the values don't support people. And we have to honor the victims of Cairo by fighting for religious freedom.
Madam High Representative,
Mr. Khan.
I want to first congratulate the rapporteur for this balanced and comprehensive report. Last Saturday was Human Rights Day, celebrating the dignity and worth of every human being. Today, we heard the moving testimonies of the Sakharov Prize laureates and their extraordinary work for women affected by ISIS' campaign of sexual violence. But we have so much more to do. Today, there are reports in Aleppo of civilians being killed on the spot, mass detentions and bodies abandoned in the street. There have been serious human rights violations against Rohingya civilians, violations against civilians in occupied Kashmir, and similarly attacks against Coptic Christians in Egypt. It is a sad catalogue of suffering. We need to redouble our efforts to aid those who need it most and call for the perpetrators for those violations to be held to account in every possible forum. Human rights are not a matter of derogation. Instead, they should become the strongest pillar in all external policies and relations of the European Union.
Domnul Marias, 1 minut.
Mr. Marias, 1 minute.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. President. Protection of human rights means nothing if we don't protect civil and economic rights of civilians. Together with other colleagues in the Council of Europe 3.5 years ago, we were able to pass an important resolution according to which austerity is an infringement of human rights. And that is very clear. We can see it across the board. We see how austerity has forced Greece to its knees. It's affected the poor populations throughout Europe. And there's a clear infringement of human rights. Also in Greece, there is a further issue as well. The thousands of refugees who are stuck on the Aegean Islands are in a horrendous situation right now. Their rights are being infringed as well. And that really, we have to start to do something with these refugees on the Aegean Islands. At the same time, the rights of the inhabitants of those islands are being infringed, given the situation there. Thank you.
Mrs. Gabriel, 1 minute 30. Firstly, I'd like to thank the rapporteur, congratulate the rapporteur for his work. I'd like to pick out 4 points. The first, as the report says, the size of the migrant flow has raised important human rights issues. The launching of Operation Sophia is a way of finding the smugglers and also protecting human rights. Human rights have to be a red line in dialogue we have with other countries as relates to migrants, particularly in relation to La Valette. The second thing is the key role of the EU. You underline the role of protecting human rights given the deterioration of situations. Sending missions to observe elections, provided sufficient resources are allocated. Then the role of impunity and the International Criminal Court. Yes, the EU needs to remain firm on the Statute of Rome, but I think we need a real strategy to promote support for the International Criminal Court for the states that haven't actually signed up yet. We need to constructively criticize states. And then the 2016-2020 action plan in terms of equality between men and women. Today, the message that we're sending is very strong. Let's make it concrete, specific. Mr. Assis, thank you, President. I'd like to first of all congratulate the rapporteur on the quality of the report and lament the way in which the extremists in this Parliament deal with the issue of human rights, as has been shown throughout the course of this debate. This report rigorously underlines the problems that the world is facing in terms of human rights. Human rights are suffering, are going backwards in many areas of the world, and the Union is working to stop that. There is some progress in terms of the agreements, the inclusion of human rights clauses in the trade agreements and the increase in impact assessments in these agreements. But these are timid steps forward. Wars, migration, smuggling of people, situation of migration, the situation of human rights defenders, disrespect for minorities. Mr. Kripek, a minute.
Ďakujem, pán predsedajúci. Európska únia chce exportovať ľudské práva a demokraciu.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, the European Union has to export human rights and democracy, which are great values, but it's rather paradoxical that it's a Europe in democratic decline that wants to give lessons about prosperity. With what right? If we want to respect human rights, what we need to do first and foremost need people who are going to be affected by that. We've got 1.58 women, children per woman, and the birth rate is falling seriously. And look at countries like Slovakia where this is happening as well. So, you know, we need to give more support for traditional families and marriage if we're going to have the humans to support the human rights. There are many paragraphs in here which talk about this matter. It's rather surprising. The EU and its development aid has to support families because it's through that we'll have stable democracies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to talk about a specific example to illustrate this important case. I went to Iraq just a few days ago, and I'm sure that Mrs. Mogherini is very familiar with the situation there and is doing everything she can to ensure that the situation improves in that country. And I think that first of all we need to look at security, because security is the first thing. There's no point in talking about anything else if we don't have security. We need to have a dialogue. There are thousands of people who would like to return home, but it is impossible. And we need to provide them with food, we need to provide them with water to drink, and we need to provide education for their children. Those are the three essentials. Thousands of people will leave Iraq if we don't help them. So either we help them there or they will come to Europe. Thank you.
Momentul de față trecem la procedura Catch the Eye și vă pot anunța.
Let's now go to Catch the Eye. I'll give the floor to all the groups that put their name down. So we have 7 colleagues who are going to take the floor. Mr. Schroeder.
Thank you. Today, when human rights is under threat worldwide, when more and more people are fleeing from war and armed conflicts, and when there are more than 250 million children alone living in countries affected by conflict, many of them being forcibly displaced, a coherent and strong EU action is ever more important in order to support the development of long-term sustainable solutions in areas of conflict and oppression. This is why I believe that the report rightly points out the need to mainstream our human rights and democracy support actions across all policies with an external dimension such as development, migration, trade and neighbourhood policy. A more focused, systematic and coordinated use of our human rights instruments is thus essential, but just as essential is that the EU increase its credibility worldwide and lead by example in the area of democracy, human rights and respect for minorities. Thanks.
Mulțumim, doamna Ward.
Thank you, Mrs. Ward.
There is no doubt that the situation of human rights in the world today is dire. As we speak, the Assad regime is destroying what is left of besieged Aleppo, reportedly massacring thousands of civilians. Our thoughts and actions are with those suffering right now. We must also stand up and fight for the release of human rights defenders and political prisoners around the world. Sadly, human rights defender Nabil Jabad, seen here, is still in prison whilst the Bahraini government reviews his tweets. The European Union, you, High Representative, must demand his immediate release. In Iran, UK Iranian citizen Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe has been imprisoned for unknown charges, separated from her baby daughter and her husband Richard. The UK government and EU diplomats must do more to secure her release. Together with my colleagues, I will continue to do what I can to ensure she comes home safely. And colleagues, I would urge all of you to take part in the annual Amnesty International Right for Rights campaign for the release of political prisoners. Thank you.
Председател, уважаема госпожо Могерини, уважаеми колеги, годишният доклад за правата на човека и демокрация.
Chairman, the annual report reflects the fact that 2015 was a year of serious challenges for the human rights and democracy. Incessant military conflicts, limiting of freedom of speech of media, increasing discrimination and the language and the hate speech. In the context of this complicated situation, I find the acts of the European Union as successful and adequate. Nonetheless, I believe the European Union could respond respond better to the numerous challenges to the human rights if it acts in coordinated manner, use all the instruments it has. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I took the floor to propose to you, Mrs. Mogherini, a very specific idea on the ongoing talks on Cyprus. Please support the right and the obligation of the two leaders in Cyprus to propose their own suggestion on the issue of the safety and guarantees. In case we will face a new collapse, the leaders representing the Cypriots, they should respond accordingly and in common line. And they should respond because they represent the Cypriots. No one else. Support them to do so. One final thing. Try to establish in Cyprus an important European institution. Institutions, as you know, provide more safety than the armies. Not to say the opposite, that armies provide uncertainty and safety than safety. Thank you so much.
Mulțumim, domnul López.
Thank you very much, Mr. López Aguilar.
Presidente, Vicepresidenta.
President, Mr. Lambrinidis, High Representative, the situation of human rights and democracy, is it worse than it has ever been in history? No, but it's true that problems and violations of human rights had never been so visible around the world. We saw yesterday and this morning with the very moving witness of two young Yazidis who were brutally tortured and violated. But the EU shouldn't just recognize them with the Sakharov Prize. It also needs to put in place a common defense and security policy which will defeat the perpetrators of violations of human rights. And we need to link this debate to the debate of yesterday. Violations of women's rights and sexual and reproductive rights against minorities, religious minorities, and because of sexual orientation. We need to ratify the European Convention on Human Rights, and we need to be clear. It's not enough for the EU to be a space that's free of human rights. We also need to defend the moral aspects.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. 2015 was also a difficult year. There were many violations of human rights. The microphone has been cut off. And democracy has suffered in many parts of the world. Non-governmental organizations have been restricted in many countries, and activists and journalists and bloggers have been attacked. The Lisbon Treaty strengthened the commitment of the European Union on the international scene, but we need to do much more to guarantee fundamental freedoms, the respect of human dignity, the principles of solidarity and equality. The terrorist threat has also affected Europe, first in Paris and then in Brussels, and that severely tested our systems. The report stresses the need to weigh out the required for security against the civil rights as well. We need to set up a European space of rights which is genuinely inclusive, and it's not only on a geographical basis. That has to be a priority at EU level and from member states. Thank you.
Aceasta am încheiat procedura Catch the Eye.
Thank you. That concludes Class the Eye. And now let me give the floor to Mrs. Mogherini.
Briefly, just to say that I fully share the views of most of you. All of your observations will obviously inform our constant daily work, and also including some suggestions that were more focused on precise elements or files we're working on, from the individual cases to the big crisis zones. Some of you, I think Panzeri said, human rights are a fundamental component of every single policy of the European Union. This is exactly my commitment, and it's also my institutional responsibility for what concerns the external policies of the European Union. Try to make sure that human rights are at the centre of whatever we do, being it security, being it development, being it trade, being it all the external policies we run.
Let me also underline, I share very much what some of you said, this also requires a policy coherence in our internal policies. And this goes beyond my institutional responsibilities, but this is at the core of my political worries. The more we are consistent with human rights respect and promotion inside our borders, the more we are credible and also powerful in making human rights protected and promoted outside of the Union. And as many of you remembered and recalled the fact that we are a community of values and not only a community of people or policies, I would really plead for you to use, at least in this chamber, an appropriate language. I've heard words today that were hurting me very much, especially after having heard the testimony of two girls that have shown an incredible courage this morning, not only for what they have lived, but also for sharing this experience with others, reliving their experiences in such a painful way. Hearing in this room words like imported people, as if people would be traded or imported or exported, I think is really something we should pay attention to do, especially in this room, to honour the community of values that you all represent in this chamber. Work continues with our special representative, with Stavros. Work continues every single day on all the different files, and I am sure that we will continue to work together in this respect, with the role of the European Parliament at the centre of our daily work. And the European Union will continue to be, at least externally, and I hope also internally very strongly, the most active, the most dedicated, the most committed promoter and defender of human rights in the world. Because we see all the limits of our work, we see all the limits of our results, a lot of frustration sometimes, still we continue. But if you look around in the world, you realise that we are the most committed, the most dedicated, the most convinced promoters of human rights all over the world. And I will continue together with you to be strongly committed to this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, High Representative. And now let me give the floor to Mr. Weidenholzer.
Well, I would like to thank all of the colleagues for having picked up on the various aspects that I wasn't able to deal with in their speeches. I would like in particular to thank the High Representative, Mrs. Mogherini, for having made it so clear that human rights infringements, basically, where we see that where they're not respected with democracy and the rule of law, there's a huge lack of security as well. That's a very important statement which has to be respected in everyday policy as well. There are 3 points I would briefly like to pick up on. We were talking about the implementation of penalties and sanctions. An instrument is only good if it has teeth. And that means that we have to do a lot in order to improve this instrument. It's good if we see new developments as well. We looked at drones in this report. That's something completely new, pretty much outside the normal legal framework. But suddenly it could become involved with infringements of human rights as well, because machines are overtaking the responsibility. And it's something which we were not familiar with thus far. And so that's an aspect that we have looked into in great detail. Also hate speech, freedom of expression on the internet, etc. We need to become more active on those fronts. Of course, to answer some of the colleagues who are no longer in the hemicycle, of course, yes, we have also talked about infringement of human rights in the EU. Remember that yesterday we were talking about basic rights as well, and you voted on that, which was criticised in retrospect as well. I'd also briefly like to say that we should think about how we could reform the human rights report. It should be longer, more specific, it will be more adapted to the timing, and it should better make it possible to have better communication possibilities with the Commission, and the Special Representative for Human Rights obviously has a major role to play. To conclude, let me make one further point. We've discussed human rights at length today. But in all of that, we should be thinking of the people in Aleppo who right now, as we talk, are experiencing such horrendous things.
Dezbaterea este închisă. Cu aceasta, votarea va...
Thank you. That concludes the debate, and the vote will be tomorrow. That brings us now to the next item on today's agenda, and that is the report by Mr. Brok on the implementation of the common foreign and security policy. Let me give the floor now to Mr. Brok.